The way a gesture used to ward off trouble became cheerful, waving. There was so much looming and vanishing to take note of, always. We felt like play actors before we knew what we were about, and after. Turns out the mummy's curse is real. You pump thick death out of the ground and burn it, it kills you. But in all the movies, curses are a cheap plot trick. The doofus who can't read the hieroglyph dies first, and no one misses him, them. We were born yesterday. We're sorry.
It feels strange to say that I enjoyed a poem about the human destruction of a livable climate, but I really did enjoy this poem, and I appreciated the horror tropes that you use in the poem to describe that destruction. And so I was wondering if you had any particular horror film in mind while you were writing.
Not any particular one, but the genre, because it is a genre of the mummy and the curse of the mummy, the mummy's curse. All of those movies are, the old ones and the new ones are pretty much alike. There's a warning, it's either a legend or it's an inscription, and someone translates it, either the native informant from the area or the wise old archaeologist reads it, and it says something like, whoever opens this tomb dies, some kind of thing like that. But of course, there's always someone on the expedition who's reckless or ambitious or stupid and just has opened the door, and mayhem ensues, of course. But it occurred to me suddenly, and I don't remember how or why, but it occurred to me that you could map those tropes almost exactly over our history with fossil fuels. I mean, first of all, oil is really mummified plant matter from eons ago, buried under the ground. Secondly, we've been given lots of warnings for the last 60 years that it's dangerous to keep pulling it out. We're going to get in trouble if we pull it out. But we just keep finding new ways to do it. Fracking, drilling the Arctic, etc. So I saw some similarities that could make an analogy or a metaphor. The metaphor is kind of campy and familiar, and nobody's really afraid of mummies. But so it's got a friendly surface, but underneath, I think the danger is real and maybe comes out at the end because, there is something scary that could come out of the ground, and that is coming out of the ground, climate change.
Yeah. Well, talking about the end of the poem, it ends with, we were born yesterday, we're sorry.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, is this a kind of birth announcement, an acknowledgement of humanity's brief existence on a geologic timescale? Or does the poem have an addressee? Who is it? Or is the we're sorry simply a state of mind for humanity?
Well, several of those things could be true. I mean, I, do usually imagine who the speaker is. I'm not sure that I always imagine who the addressee is. Or I imagine not exactly who the speaker is, but what sort of person or entity the speaker is. Here, I kind of imagine that the speaker is, human beings, or the human beings from the developed countries saying, oh, too late, sorry, we ruined the planet. We are sorry, but we haven't been here that long. We were born yesterday. We don't know much. Turns out we're innocent, we're babies, so forgive us. It's one of those obviously inadequate apologies.
Yeah, for a poem about humanity's end, it's very entertaining, so thank you.
That's an interesting point, because that I don't know about struggle with, but that I'm aware of myself is that I'm writing things that give me pleasure, if they work well, things that are amusing, they amuse me a little bit, and when I read them, audiences are often amused, and yet, the problem's very serious, and So I too, like you, I'm taking pleasure in something awful. Well, of course, when you watch a movie like that, you are too. I mean, you're taking horror movies, you're always taking pleasure in something awful. So it's something that we humans do, for better or worse. The idea that producing a string of nonsense syllables while pointing toward an object may cause that object to change is common in children on the verge of language. The idea that force exists only as an interaction between objects, while an object is a kind of kink in a force field. The idea that if one survives X number of years, one will live to see how things turn out, or even that things end well. In the future, we will face new problems. How will we represent the variety of human types once all the large animals are gone? As sly as a mother? As hungry as an orphan?
Thank you very much for reading that poem, Speculative Fiction, from your new book, Conjure.
There it is. I love the cover. I love this partially existing bunny.
Yes, this bunny that is a construction of plant matter and weed and twiggy matter. I love it. And one thing I like about this poem is that there is a string of magic or fairy tale that runs throughout the poem. And in the first part of the poem, it's this idea of language acquisition, of force, and of lifespan correlating with happy endings. The second part brings the reader back to reality with the line, in the future, we will face new problems. And more specifically, the problem of extinction. And maybe even we can say mass extinction. And then you bring the magic of language back in the final stanza with a couplet of similes. I'm wondering, does the power of language to assign and reassign meaning give you any hope in the human ability to change for the better?
That is a hard question that is often asked. And it's often asked, I guess, because it's important. And I don't have a clear yes or no answer, but I could talk about it a little bit. I mean, in the poem, I would say that ultimately language fails. In the poem, we end in a kind of dystopic situation where the language is not keeping up with the situation. I mean, the speaker in that part of the poem is speaking as if the problem is a linguistic problem. What will we call, if we can't say as hungry as a horse, what will we say? As hungry as a mother? So the speaker is, perhaps humorously, perhaps, horribly, focusing on the linguistic problem when the problem is really, extinction, hunger, displacement, etc. What I would say about this poem, you mentioned magic, is that every part of it, every stanza of it, arguably the stanza about physics and force, but all of the rest of them are examples of kind of magical thinking. And it's a magical thinking that fails. That, obviously I would say the idea that if you survive X number of years, if you live to be old, then you'll see how things turn out. Well, things never turn out, they just keep going. And, who knows what could happen the day after you die. It's not like, well, everything's looking good, I'm out of here.
Yeah, the next day Donald Trump could be elected president, right?
Exactly. So it's a mystery. I think a lot of times my poems begin when I don't understand something, or when I get the feeling of kind of, start with a kind of puzzlement. And I'm interested in science because, well, I've always been interested in science, but I think science must start with that same feeling, with a question, with why is that? Or, what is that? How does that work?
Yeah.
And, even though they're much more practical than we poets are, some of us poets start from the same place, I think. At least I do.
Yeah. Do you often find yourself delving into more scientific texts or textbooks, or even, I'm not sure, like scientific articles, with the idea that it's going to feed your poetry? Or is it more that you go to that for the pleasure of learning and understanding?
Well, I started, of course, at first going to it for the pleasure of learning and understanding. But once I saw that it could feed my poetry, since my poetry is a kind of vampire, it wanted more and more and more. So then I had to do more.
I like that.
And the original innocent pleasure became, utilitarian. How would you describe a God who could use magic but doesn't? Who prefers elaborate widgets and toggles, seconds toppling one by one, the careful recording of endless instructions? We're riveted by the hell show. The devil plays a huckster. What will he come out with next? Demons banished for dramatic effect are brought back to lobby for poisoning children. We can't believe they let us watch. In fact, they make us.
I love the first part of the poem because it actually makes me think of The Wizard of Oz a little bit, behind the curtain.
I wasn't specifically of that, but that doesn't matter. That works. Yes. There are all kinds of ideas of God, and one idea of God, this is kind of the Enlightenment God, I guess, which is a very mechanistic God who invents the laws of physics and then stands back and watches everything work perfectly and doesn't need to get involved. This is the deist idea that maybe the founding fathers had. But what the spin that I put on it was that you could imagine this kind of God as a sort of, well, what we unkindly sometimes call a dweeb or a nerd who's got this model railroad set of the universe here, and he's just watching it run around and run off the tracks. And
do you think you are more frustrated by the idea of a God who could intervene on behalf of the abused and the oppressed and chooses not to, or the idea of people who publicly profess devotion to God and like a compassionate, like an evangelical message, and then demonstrate a lack of compassion for others?
Well, I find that latter, a more disgusting, disturbing, thing. One does see that, and I don't want to be too specific, but you see it among some politicians, for instance, where they proclaim themselves to be Christians and then want to take away what little the poor have, right? So that's something that disturbs me. I wouldn't say that either idea of God particularly disturbs me, because I really don't believe in a personal God, so I can't get mad at him. If I did believe in a personal God, I probably would be mad at him. I'd be going, no, what are you doing? This works in mysterious ways isn't working for me. But I think what's happening in the poem is that the God that's described is kind of boring, and so we move on to the devil in the second part, because that's more entertaining.
Yes, I think that has become very apparent more than ever in the past several years.
Right, and that was my exact inspiration. So the second half is really about the Trump administration in the guise of the devil, which isn't much of a stretch. And he is a showman, right, Trump? What I'm really interested in, though, is the rest of us, how in this case we could get bored with the God who is, the point may not be whether he's intervening or not intervening, but he's working slowly and he's interested in the way he's setting up his big plan, and it might take a while and it's boring, as opposed to, the showman of the devil.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's how we are. We want things to happen fast. And
Yeah.
now that we've been watching the Hell show for a while, I think we are all kind of addicted to it, even if we hate it. Human interest, patrolling the border on 4 legs. On a plain, silent screen, a clothed moose and baboon visit an aquarium where the fish are nude, albeit fluorescent pink. This film's meant to help kids identify rare animals, or it's meant to normalize captivity. But the glass breaks and the couple is swept out onto the street where a grave koala addresses survivors from a mound of wreckage. Is this a joke? My account is frozen and I wake up cold. Skulls of all sizes on his shirt, a parrot on his arm, a man shuffles into a supermarket.
Thank you for reading Enclosures from your book, Conjure, again. The first section of the poem is kind of a sick joke. The human interest story on the border is the dogs who work for the Border Patrol, sniffing out migrants, presumably,
Right.
instead of the adults and the kids who are not only trying to get to the US for a better life, but end up being separated and detained.
I would agree that it's a sick joke, but I didn't make it up.
I believe you.
When I lived in San Diego, a lot of this book was written after I moved up here to the Seattle area, but some of it was written when I still was in San Diego, and that poem is one of them. And it's just something that I heard as a teaser for a local news story, I think. Stay tuned, human interest.
Mm-hmm.
I probably added the words human interest, but it was patrolling the border on 4 legs. Wait, it's going to be cute and heartwarming,
Oof.
It was sort of like, how can someone say that? I mean, sure, dogs can be heartwarming, but really, we're going to focus on the dogs.
I thought the middle of it is so interesting because it's this discussion of these, I guess, cartoon animals, I presume.
You're right, sort of, but I want to say where I actually saw them just because it's kind of interesting.
Oh, please do.
It was on an airplane. It was a movie for kids, so you're right, it's animated, probably Disney movie. I don't know which one, because I had the sound off, of course. But I was, looking up at it because it was right in front of my face. It was not one of these planes that gives you a little TV. It was back when there was a big screen that came down. So screen's there, and I'm not listening to it. Didn't pay for it, but sometimes I look up at it. It just seemed very surreal, as most movies seem surreal if you have the sound off, by the way. But especially this, and it seemed to be about how some animals are really people because they have clothes on, but some animals are not really people, and they're captured and put behind glass, and then the ones who are really people are talking about them. And so I just started making notes about it. I mean, yeah. I have a blank book that I take with me everywhere. And whenever something interests me or seems strange, like it might be interesting, I just start writing it down. And I didn't really realize when I wrote the thing about the border down that it would be the beginning, the first section of a poem. Mm-hmm. I don't always know that. But after I got the part about the animated animals, I realized that there were ways to make a segue there. I mean, they're both animals, they're both being presented as cute, but something maybe disturbing is happening too. So I could, make there was a kind of resonance between those things. So I decided that could be the start of a poem. A lake's hither and here, its pearly indecision and mysterious clear spot, its drifting skein of small worries is one way of being at peace. To arrive at this can't have been easy. This oval wafer body, flat yellow eyes on either side of what should not be called a nose, it is rather the point you make to provide yourself with direction as you shrug, glide around your tank, your form arcane and ecstatic. Let's play a game. What do a fish and a lake have in common? Nothing. A lake is a reflective state, while a fish is somebody.
One of the things I really liked about this poem was that it made me think of the koan format, asking a question that's a bit philosophical. What do a fish and a lake have in common? And your answer surprised me a little bit. They have nothing in common. A fish is somebody, while a lake is a reflective state. Were you thinking of any koans while you were writing the poem, or that inspired you to write it?
Not directly, although when I was younger, when I was in my early 20s, I read some Buddhist literature, and I was taken with koans, so I have that in the back of my mind. I think in the foreground of my mind was more like a joke format, which works the same way, really. You ask for one thing and you get something completely different, something you weren't expecting. And this, I think, but it does work like a koan too. I think you're right. The simple nothing is not what you were expecting. I agree. And it's kind of funny, just because it seems incongruous, but it's not really incongruous. I mean, there's a lot of ways that they have nothing in common. I agree. It's not what we were expecting. For one thing, poets are always making similes. They're always comparing things and finding ways to make things similar. And I just thought, well, what if I didn't do that? What if I just refused to make the simile? So that's part of the joke.
I like what you were saying about contradictions, because the lake is described with words like indecision, skein. I think it's skein, right? That's the pronunciation of that word. Mysterious, and worries, but it's also described as a way of being at peace. And to me, that seems like the idea of meditation, which it's not such a far-flung concept when you're talking about things like a koan.
I'm not really a meditator, but I've tried it from time to time. So it's something I'm, aware of, and it's on my mind. And this was written, as you might imagine, really sitting by a lake, because that's how I write. I pretty much write about what's in front of me. My friends went kayaking, and I decided to stay behind and stare at the lake and see if I could write, but also just, feel the peace that you get when you're looking at water. I think it's interesting that we tend to feel peaceful when we look at water, and, it's interesting to think about why. Because, as you say, water is often moving in restless ways, and yet we still feel peaceful when we look at it. So I think that in terms of meditation, I'm no expert meditator, but maybe in a way I am, because I think to write a poem, you have to be able to clear your mind. You can't be thinking about what you're going to buy at the store or what you should put in your picnic. If you can't clear your mind of stuff like that, you can't write. So you have to be able to empty the workspace, kind of. Yeah. And after that, whatever you see in front of you bubbles up and maybe creates words, maybe creates thoughts. That's pretty much how I do it. And so these descriptions here really were descriptions of what I saw and was thinking about at the lake, which was in fact Lake Quinault, in case anyone's interested, on the Olympic Peninsula. Very pretty.
Very nice.
But, the mysterious clear spot, its drifting skein of small worries. Well, that was, in a way, drifting skein is just was what the ripples looked like to me. I mean, a skein is a kind of crosshatch, right? I think, when weaving. And, I thought of small worries because ripples are small waves and waves are disturbances. But, it's not very disturbing if they're not only small, but always repeating, always, looking the same in the same place. Then it's not truly disturbing. It just has that, impression on the surface. Sometimes our little worries can, maybe are hiding bigger things. Maybe in fact the little worries are what keep us from being actually frightened.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Rae, for speaking with me, for reading your poems from your new book. It's gorgeous.
And thank you for your good questions. They actually made me look again at the poems and kind of dig deeper and think about some of them in different ways.